What if I told you that the entire foundation of North American trade is cracking right before our eyes? Canada, America's closest ally and trading partner for generations, has just made a shocking deal with China. And President Donald Trump is now threatening what can only be described as a tariff apocalypse in response. We are talking about a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States. This is not speculation. This is not rumor. This is happening right now. And the consequences could reshape the global economy in ways we have never seen before. The relationship between Washington and Ottawa has never been this tense, and Beijing is watching closely, ready to capitalize on every fracture in this once unbreakable alliance. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about international trade and the future of North American cooperation. Let me take you through exactly what happened and why this matters so much. In January of 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a strategic partnership with China that sent shockwaves through Washington. This deal would allow Beijing to lower tariffs on Canadian canola and agricultural products, which sounds beneficial for Canadian farmers who have been struggling under the weight of American trade restrictions. But here is where it gets controversial. In exchange for this agricultural relief, Ottawa agreed to allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market. Now, you might be thinking, what is wrong with more electric vehicles? The problem is not the vehicles themselves. The problem is what this represents in the larger geopolitical chess game between the United States and China. President Trump immediately saw this as Canada becoming a backdoor for Chinese products to flood into North America, potentially bypassing American tariffs and trade restrictions designed to protect domestic industries. President Trump wasted no time in responding to this announcement. He took to Truth Social, his preferred platform for major policy declarations, and delivered a warning that left no room for interpretation. Trump declared that Prime Minister Carney was sorely mistaken if he thought Canada could become a drop-off port for Chinese goods entering the United States. The language was deliberate and pointed. Trump framed this not just as a trade dispute, but as a fundamental betrayal of the North American partnership. He made it abundantly clear that if Canada proceeded with this China deal, the consequences would be severe and immediate. A 100% tariff on all Canadian goods would essentially create an economic wall between two nations that have enjoyed virtually seamless trade for decades. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in annual trade being subjected to punishing duties that would make Canadian products prohibitively expensive for American consumers and businesses. The implications of such a tariff cannot be overstated. Canada and the United States share the longest undefended border in the world, and their economies are deeply intertwined in ways that most people do not fully appreciate. Canadian oil flows south to American refineries. American automotive parts cross the border multiple times during the manufacturing process. Supply chains that took decades to build are now facing existential threats. If Trump follows through on his 100% tariff threat, we could see immediate disruptions to everything from energy supplies to food products to manufactured goods. Canadian businesses that depend on American customers would face devastating losses, and American companies that rely on Canadian inputs would see their costs skyrocket. This is not just a diplomatic spat between two leaders with different visions. This is a potential economic earthquake that could send tremors through markets around the world. And the most alarming part is that neither side seems willing to back down. I need to explain why Canada made this shocking deal with China in the first place, because understanding the motivation is crucial to grasping the full scope of this crisis. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not wake up one morning and decide to antagonize President Trump for no reason. This Canada-China partnership represents a fundamental shift in Canadian trade strategy that has been building for months. driven by what experts describe as a wake-up call about the dangers of overdependence on the American market. For too long, Canada has put almost all of its economic eggs in the American basket, and the Trump administration's aggressive tariff policies have exposed just how vulnerable that position truly is. Carney, who spent years as a central banker and understands risk management better than most politicians, has framed this diversification strategy in financial terms. He compared it to a diversified investment portfolio that reduces exposure to any single risk. When one investment performs poorly, others can compensate and maintain overall stability. Trade lawyer Matthew Cronby of the firm Osler provided what I consider to be the most insightful analysis of this situation. He described the warming of Canada-China relations as probably the best example of the consequences for Canadian trading relationships of what has happened under Trump 2.0. Think about that statement for a moment. A prominent trade expert is essentially saying that Trump's own policies have pushed Canada directly into the arms of China. This is not what the Trump administration intended when it imposed tariffs on Canadian aluminum, steel, and other products. The goal was supposedly to pressure Canada into more favorable trade terms for the United States. Instead, it has created a situation where America's closest neighbor is actively seeking alternative partners, including America's primary strategic rival. The irony here is almost too thick to ignore. In trying to put America first, Trump may have inadvertently accelerated a realignment of global trade that leaves America more isolated than before. Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, attempted to calm the situation by pushing back against Trump's characterization of the deal. He insisted there was no pursuit of a free trade deal with China, describing the arrangement as merely a resolution on several important tariff issues between Ottawa and Beijing. LeBlanc was clearly trying to downplay the significance of the partnership, perhaps hoping to avoid further escalation with Washington. But here is the problem with that approach. The distinction between a free trade deal and a tariff resolution appears to be lost on the Trump administration, which views any Canadian economic engagement with China as a direct threat to American interests. From Washington's perspective, it does not matter whether you call it a partnership, an agreement, a resolution, or a handshake deal. What matters is that Canada is opening its doors wider to Chinese products while American goods face mounting barriers. The optics alone are damaging, and in international relations, optics often matter as much as substance. The timing of this confrontation made everything worse. This Canada-China deal announcement came just days after Prime Minister Carney delivered what can only be described as a pointed address at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Standing before global leaders and economic elites, Carney declared that we are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Those words were widely interpreted as a direct rebuke of Trump's policies and a signal that Canada was charting its own course, regardless of American objections. Carney did not mention Trump by name, but he did not need to. Everyone in that room understood exactly who he was talking about. The speech was a declaration of independence from the old way of doing business, a statement that Canada would no longer simply follow Washington's lead on trade policy. For Trump, who values loyalty and deference above almost everything else, this public challenge must have felt like a slap in the face. The Davos speech set the stage for the tariff apocalypse threat that followed, and it revealed just how deep the rift between these two nations has become. I want to take you deeper into the transformation that has occurred in Canada-United States relations, because this is not just about one deal or one tariff threat. We are witnessing the end of an era. For decades, the relationship between Ottawa and Washington was characterized by deep economic integration and tight security cooperation. These two nations fought side by side in world wars, built joint defense systems like NORAD, and created trade agreements that made their economies virtually inseparable. The border between Canada and the United States was often described as the longest undefended border in the world, a testament to the trust and friendship that existed between these neighbors. But now, as Prime Minister Mark Carney himself declared in March of 2025, the old relationship we had with the United States is over. Those are not my words. Those are the words of Canada's leader, spoken publicly and without qualification. When a prime minister announces that the relationship with America is over, we have entered unprecedented territory. What does it mean for the old relationship to be over? It means that Canadian businesses and governments are actively diversifying trade relationships with Europe, the Asia-Pacific region, and even traditional rivals like China. It means that Canada is no longer willing to accept whatever terms Washington dictates, no longer willing to be taken for granted as a reliable partner who will always fall in line. The Canada-China deal is just the most visible manifestation of this shift, but it is far from the only one. Canadian officials have been meeting with European Union counterparts to strengthen transatlantic ties. They have been exploring opportunities in Southeast Asia and Latin America. They have been looking anywhere and everywhere for alternatives to the American market that has been their economic lifeline for so long. This diversification is not happening out of spite or ideological opposition to the United States. It is happening because Canadian leaders have concluded that depending on America is simply too risky in the Trump era. The International Bar Association released an analysis that I find particularly compelling. They noted that the Canada-China deal is emblematic of how Trump's tariff policies are reshaping global trade alliances in ways that may ultimately harm American interests. This is the fundamental paradox of the current situation. President Trump claims to be putting America first, protecting American workers and industries from unfair foreign competition. But his methods are driving allies away and creating new partnerships that exclude the United States entirely. When Canada strikes a deal with China, that is trade that could have gone to American farmers, American manufacturers, American workers. When European nations strengthen their ties with Asia, that is economic activity that bypasses American companies. The tariff apocalypse that Trump threatens against Canada might satisfy a desire for punishment, but it could ultimately leave America more isolated and less influential in the global economy. I have spoken with economists and trade experts who are genuinely alarmed by what they are seeing. They point out that global supply chains are incredibly complex and took decades to develop. You cannot simply rearrange them overnight with tariff threats and trade wars. When Trump imposes a 100% tariff on Canadian goods, American companies do not immediately find domestic alternatives. They face higher costs, production delays, and competitive disadvantages against foreign rivals who can still access Canadian inputs at normal prices. Canadian companies, meanwhile, accelerate their pivot toward other markets. Relationships that took generations to build are severed, and rebuilding them later, even if political winds shift, is extraordinarily difficult. The damage being done right now to Canada-United States relations may take decades to repair, if it can be repaired at all. And China, watching from the sidelines, is more than happy to step into the void that American retreat has created. Let me explain the specific mechanics of this Canada-China deal and why it has triggered such an extreme response from President Trump. The agreement centers on two main elements that have massive strategic implications. First, China agreed to lower tariffs on Canadian canola and agricultural products. This might sound like a minor trade adjustment, but canola is one of Canada's most important agricultural exports, and Chinese tariffs had been devastating Canadian farmers for years. By securing relief on these products, Prime Minister Carney delivered a tangible economic benefit to a politically important constituency. Canadian farmers who had been suffering under trade restrictions suddenly had access to one of the world's largest markets on favorable terms. This was not just about economics. It was about demonstrating that Canada could succeed without relying exclusively on American goodwill. The second element of the deal is what really alarmed Washington. In exchange for the agricultural tariff reductions, Canada agreed to allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market. Now, electric vehicles might seem like a relatively small category of trade, but they represent the future of the automotive industry. China has invested massively in electric vehicle technology and manufacturing, and their vehicles are increasingly competitive with Western alternatives. By opening its market to Chinese EVs, Canada is essentially giving Beijing a foothold in North America. President Trump and his advisors see this as a Trojan horse strategy. Once Chinese vehicles establish themselves in Canada, the fear is that they could be re-exported to the United States, or that Canadian regulations would be influenced by Chinese standards. The 100% tariff threat is designed to prevent this scenario by making it economically impossible for goods to flow from Canada to America. President Trump's characterization of Canada as a potential drop-off port for Chinese goods reflects a broader concern about transshipment and trade circumvention. If Chinese products face high tariffs entering the United States directly, manufacturers might look for alternative routes. They could ship goods to Canada, perform minimal processing, or simply relabel them, and then send them across the American border at lower tariff rates. This practice, known as transshipment, is a constant concern for trade enforcement officials. By threatening a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods, Trump is essentially saying that he will eliminate any economic incentive for such schemes. If everything from Canada faces the same punishing tariff, it does not matter whether the underlying product is Canadian or Chinese. The economic barrier is the same. This is an extraordinarily blunt instrument, one that would devastate legitimate Canadian businesses along with any potential circumvention schemes. But Trump has never been known for surgical precision in his policy choices. The strategic implications of this confrontation extend far beyond tariffs and trade balances. We are watching a fundamental realignment of global alliances in real time. China has long sought to weaken the Western alliance system that has contained its ambitions since the Cold War. The Canada-China deal gives Beijing exactly what it wanted: a crack in the North American partnership that it can exploit and widen over time. For decades, China faced a united front of Western democracies committed to maintaining certain rules and standards in international trade. Now, those democracies are fighting among themselves, and China can play them against each other. When Trump threatens Canada with tariff apocalypse, he pushes Ottawa closer to Beijing. When Canada strikes deals with China, it validates Trump's concerns about reliability. It is a vicious cycle that benefits no one except those who want to see the Western alliance weakened and divided. I want to conclude by examining what happens next and why you should be paying very close attention to this story in the coming weeks and months. The confrontation between President Trump and Prime Minister Carney over the Canada-China deal is not going to resolve itself quickly or easily. Both leaders have staked out positions that make compromise difficult. Trump has publicly threatened a 100% tariff, and backing down would be seen as weakness by his domestic supporters. Carney has publicly declared that the old relationship with America is over, and reversing course would undermine his entire political brand of Canadian independence and diversification. We are in a classic standoff where neither side can afford to blink first. The question is whether cooler heads will prevail before the threatened tariff apocalypse actually materializes, or whether we are heading toward a genuine rupture in North American economic relations. The business community on both sides of the border is watching with growing alarm. I have spoken with executives who describe the uncertainty as paralyzing. How do you make investment decisions when you do not know whether a 100% tariff will be imposed next month? How do you plan supply chains when the rules of trade are changing daily based on presidential tweets and prime ministerial speeches? Some companies are already making contingency plans to shift operations away from cross border dependencies. Others are simply freezing investment until the situation clarifies. This uncertainty alone is causing economic damage even before any tariff is actually imposed. The threat of tariff apocalypse is functioning as a kind of economic weapon, imposing costs through fear and unpredictability rather than through actual policy implementation. Trump may view this uncertainty as leverage, but it is also eroding the trust that makes long-term economic relationships possible. The China dimension of this crisis deserves special attention as we look toward the future. Beijing has played its hand masterfully in this confrontation. By offering Canada a relatively modest package of agricultural tariff relief and electric vehicle access, China has inserted itself into the heart of North American politics. Every time Trump attacks the Canada-China deal, he reinforces the narrative that America is an unreliable partner who will bully even its closest allies. Every time Carney defends the deal, he demonstrates that alternatives to American dominance exist and are increasingly attractive. China does not need to win a trade war with the United States directly. It just needs to fracture the alliances that have historically contained Chinese influence. The Canada-China deal represents a significant step toward that goal, and we can expect Beijing to pursue similar opportunities with other American allies who feel mistreated by Trump's tariff policies. What does all of this mean for ordinary people watching the news and wondering how international trade affects their daily lives? The consequences of this confrontation will be felt in grocery stores, car dealerships, gas stations, and workplaces across North America. If Trump's 100% tariff actually takes effect, prices for Canadian goods in America will double overnight. That means higher costs for everything from maple syrup to lumber to automotive parts. Canadian businesses that export to America will lay off workers or close entirely. American businesses that depend on Canadian inputs will face impossible choices between absorbing massive cost increases or passing them along to consumers. The tariff apocalypse is not just a dramatic phrase designed to capture attention. It is a genuine possibility that would cause real hardship for millions of families on both sides of the border. I will continue to follow this story closely because the stakes could not be higher. The relationship between Canada and the United States, once the envy of the world, is being tested like never before, and the outcome will shape our economic future for generations to come. This is a story that demands your attention, and I promise to keep you informed as events continue to unfold.